Genesis 5 verse 4 contains 7 words that shatter everything you think you know about the beginning. Adam had other sons and daughters. Daughters. Plural. Unnamed. You've been told the story of the 3 sons for millennia. You know Cain, the murderer. You know Seth, the replacement. And you know Abel, the righteous martyr whose death we've mourned for ages. But look at the text again. Look at what's being hidden. While the world was distracted by the blood of the brothers, a secret was breathing in the dark. These daughters didn't just exist as background characters, they were the architects of a civilization the history books tried to erase. Adam's first daughter wasn't made from a rib like Eve. She was born of blood and screaming, the first human to experience a world already broken. While her brothers were busy fighting over territory and altars, she was asking the dangerous questions that the Bible refuses to record. 3 sons got the names. 3 sons got the legacies. But the daughters? They got the silence. The scrolls tell you Abel's death was the first great tragedy of humanity. But they're lying. The real tragedy is the story of the women who were standing right there in the shadows, watching it all happen, and why, for 6,000 years, you weren't allowed to know their names. There is a reason for the silence. And it starts with the sister who became the first feminist. She was born into grief. Abel had been dead for 2 years when Eve's body swelled with the pregnancy that would produce the first daughter. Cain was gone, marked and wandering, exiled for the blood his hands had spilled. Seth was still a child himself, too young to understand why his mother cried while grinding grain, why his father stared at the eastern horizon where Eden's gates remained locked. The birth took all night. Eve had borne 3 sons, but this was different. Longer. More painful. As if the curse recognized female flesh and pressed down harder. When the baby finally came, small, wet, squalling, Eve held her and wept. Not from pain. From recognition. "She looks like me," Eve whispered. Adam approached slowly, carefully, like the baby might shatter. He'd watched God create Eve from his own rib, instant, perfect, complete. This creature was tiny, fragile, utterly dependent. "What do we call her?" he asked. Eve looked down at the daughter in her arms. The first woman born of woman. The first female who would have to learn what it meant to be female because there was no template, no instruction, no other women in existence to show her. "Does it matter?" Eve said quietly. "The sons already have their stories." She was born into a story that had already decided she didn't matter. But she would matter anyway. By the time the first daughter was 12, she had 5 sisters. Different ages, different temperaments, different faces. But all of them shared the same strange position, existing in the margins of their brother's world. They gathered around the fire while their brothers trained with tools and weapons, while their father recited the story of creation for the 100th time, while their mother ground grain and tried not to look at the eastern sky where the angel with the flaming sword still stood guard. The daughters listened. And then they asked questions. If mother was made from father's rib, the second daughter said, "Why are we born from mother's body?" Adam's jaw tightened. That's how God designed it after the garden. "But why?" the fourth daughter pressed. "What changed?" "The curse." "Why does God speak to you but not to us?" the eldest interrupted. Silence. The sons never asked that question. They assumed God's voice was for Adam, assumed the hierarchy was natural, assumed their position at the top was divine order. But the daughters noticed the silence. They noticed that when Adam said, "God told me," he never said, "God told us." They noticed that Eve's punishment was specific, pain in childbirth, desire for her husband, his rule over her, but their punishment seemed to be inherited without the original conversation. "Why do our brothers get to name the animals?" the third daughter asked quietly, "but we don't even get to name ourselves?" Eve's hand stopped grinding. Adam stood abruptly and left the fire. That night, in the darkness of the women's cave, the daughters whispered among themselves. They created words their brothers didn't know. They invented songs about the questions that made their father uncomfortable. They built a language of their own. They were the first women to realize that history was being written, and they weren't holding the pen. The oldest daughter was 16 when Seth asked their father for her hand. Not asked her. Asked Adam. She stood outside the tent listening to her brother negotiate for her like she was livestock. Bride price, half the next harvest, 3 goats, labor on the new dwelling Seth was building. Her mother found her there, face burning with something between rage and resignation. "I know," Eve said quietly. "Do you?" The daughter's voice cracked. "Did you choose father, or were you just given to him?" Eve's silence was answer enough. The wedding happened at the next full moon. There was no ceremony because ceremony hadn't been invented yet. The daughter and her mother created it that morning, weaving flowers into hair, painting symbols on skin with crushed berries, singing songs they'd composed in secret, making something beautiful out of something they couldn't refuse. When Seth took her hand, the daughter looked into her brother's eyes and saw someone familiar. Someone she'd grown up with. Someone she'd taught to swim in the river, someone who'd helped her climb trees, someone who'd cried when Abel died. It wasn't love. But it wasn't entirely wrong either, because wrong hadn't been defined yet. There were no other men. That was the mathematical reality that Scripture doesn't mention. Adam's daughters married Adam's sons because the alternative was extinction. But the daughters negotiated. They set terms. They demanded respect. They created the concept of consent in a world where it didn't exist yet. They invented marriage contracts, dowry customs, family structures. They didn't just become wives. They became architects. The oldest daughter bore Seth's first child 9 months later. A son. Named. Then a daughter. Unnamed in the records her brothers would later write. But the oldest daughter named her anyway, whispered it in her ear while nursing, remembered. Because she refused to let her daughter be forgotten the way she'd been. They didn't just become wives. They became the mothers of everyone who would ever live. And they did it knowing the world would forget their names. While Adam and his sons were subduing the earth, the daughters were making earth habitable. The third daughter discovered agriculture. Not by accident, by observation. She noticed that seeds from the wild grains they gathered would sprout if left in disturbed soil. She experimented. Planted rows. Watered them deliberately. Waited. The first deliberate harvest came from her hands. But when Seth recorded the achievement, he wrote, "Man learned to cultivate the ground." The fifth daughter invented textiles. She watched spiders weave and thought, I can do that with plant fibers. She spent months failing, unraveling, starting over. Finally created the first twisted thread. Then the first woven cloth. Then the first garment that wasn't animal skin. Her brothers wore her creations and called it mankind's ingenuity. The second daughter developed medicine. She learned which plants reduced fever, which stopped bleeding, which eased the pain of childbirth that killed her sister. She became the first midwife, the first herbalist, the first doctor. She saved 3 women's lives in a single year. No record exists of her name. The daughters preserved food, drying, smoking, salting. They created cooking techniques that made tough meat edible, bitter plants nutritious. They developed the concept of cuisine, of flavor, of gathering around food as community. They taught their children these skills. Passed down knowledge that would survive millennia. And when Adam's sons gathered to recount humanity's great achievements, they said, man was given dominion over the earth. The daughters listened. Said nothing. Returned to their work. Every technology that kept humanity alive came from their hands. But history would call it mankind's achievement. Good. The 7th daughter was born with her mother's eyes and her mother's hunger. She grew up on stories of Eden. Every night, she begged Eve to describe it again, the tree that grew every kind of fruit simultaneously, the river that split into 4 without diminishing, the light that came from everywhere and nowhere, the presence of God that felt like being known completely and loved anyway. What did his voice sound like? She asked. Eve's face crumbled. Like everything true. Does he still speak? To your father. Sometimes. Not to you. Eve's silence was an answer the daughter couldn't accept. At 15, she began building a garden on the eastern side of their settlement. Not to live in, to remember in. She planted every beautiful thing she could find, flowering vines, fruit trees, herbs that smelled like memory. Her brothers mocked her. You can't recreate Eden. I'm not recreating it, she said, hands deep in soil. I'm creating something new. She worked alone mostly. Sometimes her sisters joined her, but the garden became hers in a way nothing else was. In a world where her father owned the land, her brothers owned the crops, her future husband would own her body, the garden was hers. She talked to God there. Not prayers exactly. Questions mostly. Am I made in your image too? Or just Father? Silence. Did you curse me specifically, or did I just inherit mother's punishment? Silence. Why do my brothers hear you and I don't? The wind moved through the leaves. Just wind. Or maybe not. Her mother found her there one evening, kneeling in the dirt, tears running down her face. He doesn't answer, the daughter whispered. Eve knelt beside her. Took her daughter's soil-stained hands. I don't know if God speaks differently to daughters, Eve said slowly. No one's ever asked before. There's never been a daughter to ask. Does that mean I'm doing something wrong? It means you're doing something new. The garden became a gathering place. The daughters met there away from their fathers and brothers and husbands. They shared knowledge, asked dangerous questions, created rituals that belonged only to them. It became holy space. Not because God's presence was obvious, but because women's presence was intentional. She couldn't return to Eden. So she built a new one. And God met her there anyway. The fourth daughter died giving birth to her third child. She labored for 2 days. The baby was wrong, positioned sideways, too large, killing her from the inside. The other daughters tried everything they knew, herbs to strengthen contractions, positions to shift the baby, prayers whispered and screamed. Nothing worked. She died at dawn, her hand gripping her oldest sister's, her last words, "Name her." The baby died an hour later. Eve arrived to find her daughter's body being washed by her surviving daughters. The mother who had buried Abel, murdered, sudden, violent, now faced burying a daughter, slow, inevitable, the curse made fatal. She fell to her knees and screamed. Not words. Just sound. The grief of a woman who ate fruit to become like God and instead became the reason her daughter just bled to death on a birthing mat. The daughters surrounded their mother. Held her. Absorbed her shaking. "This is my fault," Eve whispered. "The curse?" "No," the eldest daughter said firmly. "Death is here. We don't get to choose how it comes." They buried the fourth daughter and her baby together in the garden the seventh daughter had built. They dug the grave themselves, women's work, invisible work, the labor of remembering. They created the first funeral rites for a woman. Washing the body. Anointing it with oils the second daughter had made. Wrapping it in cloth the fifth daughter had woven. Singing songs they'd composed in the language their brothers didn't speak. Before they covered the grave, the youngest daughter asked, "Will anyone remember her name?" The oldest daughter looked at her sisters. At their mother. At the small stone marker they'd placed. "We will," she said. "That's enough." They planted a tree over the grave. Its roots would drink from her body. Its fruit would feed her children's children. She was the first woman to die. But she wasn't the first woman to be forgotten. The shift happened gradually, then suddenly. One of Seth's sons, later generations would call him Enosh, began keeping records. Not stories passed down orally, but marks on clay tablets. Permanent. Official. The daughters watched him work. He recorded lineages. Adam lived 130 years and begot Seth. Seth lived 105 years and begot Enosh. The second daughter, now a grandmother herself, stood over his shoulder. "What about us?" she asked. Enosh didn't look up. "What about you?" "The daughters. Your aunts. Your mother. We're part of the line too. You're included." He pointed to a phrase, "and begot sons and daughters." "But not our names? Do names matter if the line continues?" The silence was heavy. "Yes," she said quietly. "Names matter. The sons carry the line. The daughters." He gestured vaguely, "You're important, but the record traces through fathers." "Why?" Now he looked up, genuinely confused by the question. "That's how it's done." "By whom? Who decided?" He had no answer. The second daughter walked away. Found her sisters in the garden. "They're writing it down," she said. "Our brothers' names. Our sons' names. Counting years and generations and accomplishments. We're a footnote. Sons and daughters. Not even sons and daughters by name." The seventh daughter, older now but still tending her garden, looked up. "Should we write our own record?" The eldest daughter shook her head slowly. "Who would believe it? Who would keep it? Our sons will preserve their father's words. Not ours. So we just disappear? We're already disappearing." They sat in silence, watching the sun set over the garden, knowing that in a few generations, someone would read Enosh's tablets and assume sons and daughters meant the daughters didn't matter. The erasure was happening while they were still alive. The pen that wrote Genesis was held by a man. And he decided daughters didn't need names. The erasure wasn't accidental. The daughters threatened something fundamental, the story of creation as male-centered divine order. Adam was formed first, from dust, by God's hands. Eve was formed second, from Adam's rib, derivative, an afterthought to solve his loneliness. But the daughters? They were formed from Eve's body. Born of woman, not created by God's direct intervention. They broke the chain of male primacy. And they asked questions that complicated everything. If I'm made in God's image too, why can't I speak to Him directly? If the curse is pain in childbirth, why does it kill us sometimes? If Father has dominion, who decided dominion only flows through sons? These weren't safe questions. They implied that the hierarchy wasn't divinely ordained, it was humanly constructed. They suggested that male authority was chosen, not inevitable. They exposed the difference between what God said and what men said God said. So the daughters were written out. Sons and daughters acknowledged their existence without giving them power, without letting them complicate the narrative, without allowing future generations to point to named women who built agriculture, created textiles, developed medicine, and ask, if they did all that, why do we assume men did everything? The silence erased their questions along with their names. But the silence also freed them. Named women in Scripture, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Tamar, were frozen in their stories, defined by their best moments or their worst. Their names became their limits. The unnamed daughters of Adam could be anyone. They couldn't be controlled by reputation because they had none. They couldn't be limited by precedent because their stories weren't recorded. They couldn't be reduced to a single defining moment because all their moments were invisible. The erasure was violence. But it was also liberation. Without the pen, they couldn't write the official history. But without the official history, they couldn't be contained by it. They passed down their knowledge through daughters, through whispers, through demonstrations their sons wouldn't bother to record. They created the hidden history. The one that survived anyway. They were erased from the story. But erasure meant they could write their own. Every human being alive today descended from the daughters of Adam and Eve. You carry their DNA, their innovations, their questions. When you plant a garden, you're using techniques they invented. When you weave fabric, you're repeating motions their hands first created. When you preserve food, develop medicine, create beauty from raw materials, you're continuing work they started. Work no one bothered to credit them for. The erasure didn't end with Genesis. Every history book that talks about mankind's achievements, without specifying that women achieved half of them, that's the pattern continuing. Every time a woman's work is attributed to humanity, but a man's work is attributed to him specifically, that's the pattern continuing. Every time a daughter asks a question and is told, that's just how it is, that's the pattern continuing. But here's what the daughters of Adam knew that we forgot. Invisibility isn't the same as insignificance. They didn't need their names in Genesis to change the world. They changed it anyway. Built civilization from nothing. Passed down knowledge that survived millennia. Asked questions that still haven't been fully answered. And they did it knowing they'd be forgotten. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? Will you keep reading Sons and Daughters and assume the daughters didn't matter? Will you keep accepting histories written by the people who benefited from writing them? Will you keep silent when women's work is erased, when women's questions are dismissed, when women's names are forgotten while men's are carved in stone? Because silence isn't neutrality. It's participation. The daughters of Adam and Eve didn't need their names written in Genesis to change history. They just needed you to stop pretending they didn't exist. So what are you going to do about that?